So Schenirer was born in 1983. It's interesting. The Panovich Rav was born in 1886. Her marriage parent in 1887, and the Baron Cutler in 1892 or so. So it was like a ruach of Jewish leadership that came into the world over that 10-year period. It's really fascinating. For those who've been with us for the 5 minutes on the Dome, I think we'll appreciate that more, and hopefully we'll cover the Panovich Rav in some later shiurim. Okay, so that's when she was born, to Belzer Hasidic parents, and very frum parents. Her father was a Talmid Chacham, says, and she, as many girls alive then, were bright, broad-minded, hungry for knowledge, and there were no Jewish schools, girls' schools then. Until 7th, 8th grade, it was compulsory public education in Poland. Krakow is where she was born and raised, and did a lot of her pilot, actually. And she was a person who was full of life, very enthusiastic about Torah and the Rebbeinu Shalom. As far as I can gather, she was always from herself, quite from and quite religious, we call like a religious personality. But she began to notice that not everybody was religious and excited about Torah and the Rebbeinu Shalom like she was. She was on a winter vacation once with friends. They got to the top of the hill. She was full of Espilus Abore. Look at the beautiful world the Borei Olam made. And her friends called her Chasidka, which meant like a frumak or a frummy. Like, stop preaching your old-fashioned ways. And she spent the whole night thinking after that, what was going on? What was happening with her friends? She was interested in secular knowledge. She'd go to lectures that would go on in those times. And she would see, she was a connoisseur and learning things, but she'd see how the Jewish kids were soaking up the secular messages without any filters. One Friday night, she went with a cousin to a Zionist party or whatever it would be, owning Shabbos, and she showed the group leaders were being Machal Shabbos. And she's taking all this in. And it's really hard for us to imagine today, but as many efforts were being made for boys' education and fighting Haskalah, fighting the, so to speak, Enlightenment, and Lubavitch had many schools, Radomsk had 38 schools, Bavov, there were the Musar yeshivas, the regular yeshivas, etc. Nothing was being done for Jewish girls. I don't talk about Germany right now, what Hirsch was doing. It seems that efforts were being done, but I'm talking about Lithuania, Lita, and Poland, etc., those centers. And girls, of course, classically and fundamentally not wrong, chas v'shalom, had gotten their knowledge from Tati and Mami in the house, Al Titosh Tar Simecha, and the very few books, Tzena Rena, and they got a sense of what they needed to know halacha, to have a kesher to Rebbeinu Shalom, and to Torah, and to be good mothers, etc., good family women. But that was once enough. But when it came to the maskil-filled times, Haskalah times, and the changing ruchos that were all over of the isms, etc., in the late 1800s and 1900s, and perhaps earlier than that even, this wasn't enough. The streets were battling Torah head-on in a different way than we're used to today. Today, maybe the battle is more against materialism, not so much ideological, but there was a tremendous ideological battle against Torah values, against old values in general, against traditionalism, rationalism, against a God-focused world as opposed to a man-focused world. And girls were being opened up to secular education, and many daughters of even great Rabbanim were going off the derech in droves. And I have a theory, this is my theory, but it could be sometimes Dafka Rabbanim's daughters were more intellectual, had better genes, if you will, were smarter. Naturally, they were more naturally attracted to Chachma. They weren't getting it in Jewish places. The Torah Tmima quotes his father, the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan, the great posek, was a Rav, I believe, in Navardik, which was a small town. We think of Navardik as being a central town, which was because the Alta Navardik, etc. But as a town, it was a small town, and the Aruch HaShulchan always had a lot of karas hatov that he was zocheh to be a small town Rav, because he felt it was easier to keep the family from. And he remembers visiting one of his friends who was a big town Rav on Rosh Hashanah, and no one was there at night. And the next morning, everybody was sleeping, and it was just he and his he and his Rav friend, and finally you wanted to know what happened. He said, well, the whole family, it sounded when I read the story, it was the mother also, but certainly the kids were out at the theater, and that's how they spent Rosh Hashanah night. And this Rav, could you imagine a great Rav in a big city in Europe is eating the Rosh Hashanah meal by himself with his chashuv guest, the Aruch HaShulchan, and the Rav had cheshbon that next year the theater was going to be coming later or earlier, and therefore it was likely that he would have a Rosh Hashanah meal with his family. That was the types of times we were dealing with. I read once that a Bachar asked Reb Shimon Shkop, the great Rosh Hashiva, whether it was too much to be makbid, could he be makbid that a girl would cover her hair? Mothers would cry to Sarah Schenirer what was going on with their daughters, right? My oldest daughter is a beautiful, charming, talented, smart girl. We all love her. She loves us too and respects us. But a terrible thing has happened. The mother said, sobbing heavily. She joined the Communist Party, which is outlawed in Poland then, and has become a leading personality in it. She lectures in different towns and cities. I fear for her life and safety because the government is hunting for communist leaders to arrest them. My daughter doesn't care. She's fighting for her ideal to bring justice to the world. That's what Jewish girls were getting involved in. And defends herself by saying, wasn't it loving kindness you always taught us? And I have a young daughter. I'm scared about my younger daughter following in the footsteps. Other mothers poured their hearts out to Frosh Schenirer in the same way. Her daughter was leaving home to join a non-religious kibbutz in Palestine. Our daughters go to the movies Friday night after the Friday night Shabbos meal, which we eat early during the winter Friday nights. They just try to hide it from us. And she was hearing this and seeing what was going on. And she also saw, you have to say, that nothing really was being done. This is a quote of hers. I'm editing a little bit. As we pass through the days before the high holidays, fathers and sons travel. Thus they are drawn to Ger, to Belz, to Alexander, to Baba, great Hasidic centers. To all those places made citadels of religious life. And we stay at home, the wives, daughters, and little ones. We have an empty festival. It is bare of Jewish intellectual content. The women have never learned anything about the spiritual meaning that's concentrated within Jewish festival. The mothers go to synagogue, but the services echo faintly into the fenced and boarded-off women's galleries. There's much crying by elderly women. The young girls look at them, listen to this, as though they belong to a different century. Youth and the desire to live a full life shoot up violently in the strong-willed young personalities. Outside the synagogues, the young girls stay chattering. They walk away from the synagogue where their mothers pour out their feelings. They leave behind them the wailing of the older generation and follow the urge for freedom and self-expression. Further and further from the synagogue they go, further away to the dancing, tempting light of fleeting joy. So this is what she's seeing. No one's really doing anything. Judaism is falling apart. And she dwelled on that and thought about it and noticed it and saw that her religious fervor, which is something which was not only not shared, was everything was going the opposite way. And she realized she had to do something. And I just want to finish this, our second session on Sarah Schenirer, just to think for a second, to imagine what she did. Imagine today what it would be like if girls didn't have Jewish schools to go to. I think taking a second and thinking about that, maybe will get through to us her revolution more than anything else.